It's just okay. Amir,
Hi.
thanks for agreeing to do this dialogue with me.
Thank you.
I'm very curious.
Yeah.
Very curious is, how would you describe transcendence? How would you describe for this group the phenomena of transcendence?
Well, maybe Dave, I should say something about where I'm coming from and why you invited me here.
Okay, yeah, please, yeah.
So I'm a doctoral student at the University of Haifa in Israel. I'm at the last year of my doctoral research. And the topic is Living Transcendence, a phenomenological study of spiritual exemplars. So living transcendence is a term that I made up to point at what's called enlightenment, self-realization, God realization. Different traditions have different words for that, which is like the ultimate goal. And spiritual exemplars are people who are said to exemplify that goal. So I interviewed, in my research, I interviewed 34 such spiritual exemplars, or masters, you can call them, in different traditions around the world. And now I'm writing a few papers on the subject. So that's why they've invited me to speak about it.
Well, thanks for that context. That helps. So now on to the question I first put to you. How would you describe transcendence? What is the, what are the characteristics of it?
Okay, so I'll try to include or to kind of extract from everything that people wrote here two answers to this question. One, which I think repeated in many people's characterization of transcendence, is that it's a movement toward. So we can say it's a movement toward the sacred, the ultimate, the divine, the supreme. Maybe we can talk about the search for, the desire to unite with, to become. So that would be the movement of transcendence. And I think part of that is transcending the small ego, or the self, the small historical self. And the other way we can relate to transcendence is that it's when it's no longer a movement toward, but it's actually abiding as the ultimate, supreme, sacred, divine, God, etc., and abiding as that effortlessly, spontaneously, and choicelessly. And yeah, so we can use transcendence in either one of these ways, either as a movement or as a state of a spontaneous and choiceless state.
So abiding effortlessly, what were the other words you used? Effortlessly,
spontaneously, and choicelessly.
And choicelessly. Okay, beautiful. And why have you considered it important to study living transcendence?
I can say that it's a very personal search for me. It's part of my spiritual search, which started like 50 years ago, more or less. I felt that I want to engage with a possibility of the highest state. And since my spiritual journey has always been through relationships with people, that's kind of something I realized, that I'm not the kind of person who goes to a cave for 20 years. My spiritual journey is really through interactions and connections with other people. So I wanted to engage with that possibility of continuing my search, continuing my journey by engaging with people who exemplify that possibility. So that's why I chose to do that. So that would be one answer, which is like a very, very personal Well, the other answer is also very personal, which is I wanted to find out if there is an essence, a spiritual essence, which is common, let's say, which is beyond any specific language and tradition and conceptual framework. And I have a sense or an intuition that there is such an essence. And I figured out that if I engage with people who use very different languages and metaphors and conceptual frameworks to relate to that essence, that would also help me kind of unscrew some of the screws in my own mind about it.
Well, that's very interesting. And so you talked about choicelessly, spontaneously, and effortlessly as a potential characteristic of a living exemplar.
Yes.
What makes somebody an exemplar? What do you perceive that makes that person stand out from, you know, a priest or a monk or whatever, from the kind of regular spiritual folk, if there is such a thing?
So I think I want to return the question to everybody here.
Okay.
Which I think would make it a lot more interesting and also a lot more true to, would explain the answer I'm going to give.
Okay.
Which is, can you think, each of you, of somebody that you consider a spiritual exemplar, somebody who exemplifies for you the ideal of the spiritual journey, spiritual search, yeah, whatever you consider is the goal or the direction toward which you see that journey going. So do you know anybody that exemplifies for you the ideal of that journey? And the reason I'm answering in such a way is because I posed this question to a lot of spiritual experts, of people who are either academics, scholars, or spiritual seekers, long-term spiritual seekers. And when I analyzed their answers, one of the conclusions I came to was that it's a very subjective answer. So different people relate to, or when they explain why somebody is their spiritual exemplar, you can tell a lot about the person by who their spiritual exemplar is. And I guess what it means is that people see somebody as a spiritual exemplar depending on where they are at on their spiritual journey. And that can also change, of course, during our life. I can give a couple of themes that I found in the answers. And one is that it's somebody who integrates and unifies the vertical dimension with the horizontal dimension. So they are both a saint and a real decent human being, or a mensch, and they are connected to God, and they also somebody with a great sense of humor that you can talk about anything with, and they would be very interested in whatever you bring up. So these two dimensions of the vertical and the horizontal, the exemplars unite them in a way that brings the divine or the absolute to earth, to who we are as human beings. And they exemplify that possibility of there being no separation between the sacred and the mundane, or the divine and the human. And the other theme that I think is very interesting that I found is that people don't really, can't really pinpoint the essence of spiritual exemplarity. So a lot of people kind of danced around it and said like 200 different things about their spiritual exemplar. But when pressed against the wall, I think most people would say, well, I just know it. I recognize it. Something in me resonates. Yeah. Something in me that I feel is like the deepest in me resonates with that person. And that's how I know they're a spiritual exemplar. And that's completely subjective, but that's how I know it. So I like that answer because it corresponds with my intuition. And second, because it points at the fact that what spirituality means for us is something that is beyond actions and specific qualities. I mean, we can point at the different manifestations or expressions of spiritual exemplarity, but what it is that is manifested in all these different ways, we can't really describe. It's not an object that we can look at as anything else.
Well, it's fascinating, Amir, and I'm really enjoying your contribution and hearing about your research in a bit more detail. One of the things that's present for me, and maybe you can clarify or clear this up because you're doing like contemporary exemplars. But when we think of the history of transcendence, you know, we've got heaven and hell as escapes from well, particularly heaven, not hell, but heaven as a kind of transcendent state or ideal. We've got things like nirvana, samadhi. There's all kinds of different constructions of what an idealized spiritual state. But largely, these seem to be based on a history of getting out of the world, or like you were mentioning, being in a mountain, of somehow transcending or overcoming life circumstances to be an idealized state, but somehow detached from the world.
Yeah, well, so, I have two reservations about what you just said.
Okay, go ahead.
One is that you are not including the shamanic or indigenous traditions in that characterization.
Yeah.
Because you know, a lot of those traditions or the nature traditions, the pagans, for them it's very much being in the world of multiplicity and being as grounded and embodied as possible. Yeah. So that's a big part of spiritual tradition of humanity.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that I think that these ideas of transcending to another realm and getting out of here, I'm going to say something. I should think about it, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think that idea works for the seekers and the practitioners. I think that the people who reached the other shore, they are not just transcendent. They are not gone. They are very much here, naturally, spontaneously, and choicelessly embodying the sacred or the absolute in who they are as human beings and in all their interactions with other people, with nature, etc. So I don't think they actually fit that description.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you cleared that up because it's not totally, but I think there's a kind of an impression of that. And myself as a seeker, that was an impression of my own search, was to somehow get rid of my suffering. So if we take the fact that there is suffering and many teachers are responding to it, how are the exemplars you are relating to, or you've been researching, how are they responding to the suffering that's around them? of their fellow man or other life forms, potentially?
Well, again, there are different types of exemplars. So,
Yeah.
for example, if I think of the few, not many, but maybe 5 out of the 34 exemplars that come from the indigenous and shamanic traditions, they very much care about the ecological situation and nature and humanity's connection with the world, with Gaia. Then some of them are active on the peace, that in bringing more understanding and respect between people of different groups and ethnicities, etc., and religions. Most of them, however, are much more concerned with the suffering of people who come to them for help, for advice, for guidance, and they don't. So I have to say, most of the exemplars that I reached are not, I did not reach the Dalai Lama or the Pope or Desmond Tutu or some of the great names.
Mm-hmm.
So the people that I reached are much more concerned about groups of people from a few to a few dozens, maybe a few hundreds, who come to them for help. And that's really their main concern, or what they're thinking about, what they're engaged with, and yeah.
Okay. And I think this is sort of comes to where there's a bit of interesting tension here, because I've constructed or framed this dialogue around the relevance of transcendence to a world in crisis. So we can hear that there's local examples of responding to personal suffering, and with your more the more nature-based wisdom or exemplars, there's great concern for much of life.
Yes.
So and having, as you know, I benefited a lot from transcendent experiences myself, and a lot of me even doing this call is based on that, those realizations. So I do feel its importance, but there seems to be an urgency in responding to the global crisis, to systems decline that humanity's never faced before. So what gleanings or wisdom can you offer from your research with the exemplars with respect to this? Because I'll just say one more thing, because in a way, to be horizontally embodying the higher purpose, or God, or the transcendent, seems to be you need to engage with reality as it is right now, reality of the planet, or reality of human circumstances. So that's kind of the area that I was most interested in bringing to you in this dialogue.
Yeah, well, I'm. It may be disappointing, the answer, but
okay, well, fire away.
well, because maybe. So I think we have to distinguish between our ideas of what a fully integrated whole spiritual exemplar should be like,
yeah,
and what we find, and what we actually, if we think about our spiritual exemplars, if I think about my spiritual exemplars, they are not necessarily what you just described. Okay. And I wonder for the people, for all of us in this group, if we think about those people that we consider spiritual exemplars, do they exemplify that ideal, or the ideal that you just portrayed?
Yeah.
And maybe what you're describing is not a spiritual exemplar. Maybe that's a moral exemplar. So A moral exemplar would be somebody like Mother Teresa or different people who were very much activists to make it a better world. Maybe we should make that distinction between.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, but when I think of spiritual exemplars, they are not like my spiritual exemplars are not that active on the level that you mentioned.
Okay.
If I think of like my 3 top exemplars.
Okay.
So I wonder if it's, maybe for some of us that these are the exemplars that we would be looking for. Maybe for you, Dave.
Yeah.
Somebody would be an exemplar only if they really manifested what you're talking about, a care for the world, for the ecological crisis, for the cultural crisis that we are in. And maybe other people in this group, their spiritual exemplars have nothing to do with that. So, interesting question.
Well, maybe I'm overly idealistic, but my spiritual exemplar would also face that circumstance choicelessly, effortlessly, and what was the third one? Spontaneously. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you, because there are 2 ways about going. There are 2 ways of going about spiritual exemplars. You can intuitively think who your spiritual exemplar is, and then analyze and try to figure out why they are spiritual exemplars. Or you can think, what are my criteria for spiritual exemplarity? And then go and look for somebody who would fit those criteria.
Yeah.
So I think you would get different results in both if you go either direction.
Yeah. Well, is there anything more you'd like to say or finish up or round up the discussion as where we've got to? I think there's some interesting friction in there, and it could be that I'm being overly idealistic about what is possible for an exemplar or transcendence to encompass, and humans are limited in many ways. But I'm interested in, having gone through this exchange, is there anything more you want to add or round up or respond to where we've got to so far?
Yeah, I want to bring up a question that I'm like looking into, and I think it's an interesting question in relation to what we're talking about, which is, can we tell the difference in our own experience between ideas that we have or something we believe in, even strongly believe in, and something which is not an idea and not a belief, but is coming from an intuitive sense or longing or movement in ourselves? And I think that the 2 have somewhat of a different flavor to them.
Yeah.
So I think that it may be helpful for the discussion, for the exploration we're going to have together, to make, for each of us to make that distinction between what we believe in, what our ideals are, what ideas we have, which have a certain flavor, and what's our actual heartfelt intuitive experience is, which has a somewhat different flavor. And I think that may help.
Well, thanks for that, Amir. It's been a real joy to interact and explore this with you. I'm going to stop recording, and then I'm just going to then move people on to the next phase. So I'm going to stop recording.